Hello everyone, Vincent here from HDTV Test here. I'm a TV reviewer and professional calibrator. In this video, we're going to compare the picture quality of the Samsung Q90R 4K QLED television and the Sony XG95, which is also known as the Bravia X950G in the USA. Now, before I start, I want to just say that the Samsung Q90R is around 1,300 pounds more expensive than the Sony XG95. These are the 65-inch versions in the United Kingdom. And the Samsung Q90R is more well-spec'd than this Sony XG95. So it may not necessarily be a fair comparison. In an ideal world, I would have liked to get a Samsung Q80R in, which is around the same price, around 2,500 pounds for the 65-inch version, and also more similar in terms of the number of zones for a fair comparison, but there is probably not going to be any way I can get them both in this room at the same time. So I figured I compare these two sets while I have them here before I actually have to send them back. So before I get into the nitty-gritty of picture quality, I would like to say that these two sets have been perceptually matched in terms of the white point because they use slightly different color technology. The Samsung Q90R uses quantum dot technology to generate its colors, whereas the Sony XG95 uses PFS phosphor, so I needed to perceptually match them for the purpose of this comparison. So even before I get into the nitty-gritty of picture quality, you will probably be aware, even from the camera without me needing to explain it, that there are two immediate advantages on the Samsung Q90R versus the Sony XG95. The first is viewing angle. Even though these two sets use a VA-type LCD panel, which suffers from a traditional loss in contrast and colors when you step a bit off axis, and that's certainly what you see on the Sony XG95. If you move probably around 20 degrees or 30 degrees off center, you'll see that the colors and the contrast do take a hit and the gamma elevate as well, causing blacks to look a bit grayer. But on the Samsung Q90R, the engineers have actually implemented what they call an ultra viewing angle technology. This, as far as I'm aware, is a combination of subpixel rendering or dithering plus an optical layer in front of the LCD panel, which serves to disperse the light better to generate a wider viewing angle. So even off axis, I'm not talking really extreme off axis, but even from, let's say, 30 degrees or 45 degrees off center, the Samsung Q90R is still holding on to its colors and contrast extremely well. That I have to really praise Samsung for pushing the LED LCD innovation in this respect. The second benefit on the Samsung Q90R versus the Sony XG95 that may be apparent from the camera without me needing to explain it is the truly world-class anti-reflective filter on the Samsung Q90R. Now, I think, if you have been following my videos over the past couple of years, you may be aware that I've always thought that the anti-reflective filter that is implemented on Samsung QLEDs have been the market leader, really, especially since Philips retired their Moh-Eye filter. But for 2019, the South Korean brand has truly taken it to the next level. The anti-reflective filter on the Samsung Q90R, basically is a black hole. I mean, it's fairly bright in here. I have some lamps, shining around. And on the Sony XG95, maybe from the camera, you can see that you can still pick out individual objects from behind the camera or around the camera, but the Samsung Q90R is just basically sucking in all light. Sucking, I like that word. Sucking in all light, and really mute the reflections so that whatever picture is generated on screen is not spoiled by reflections of the surrounding objects, making it, in combination with its high light output, the best TV for use in a really bright room. So those are the two immediate advantages, and before I proceed to talk about picture quality, I would like to take this opportunity to thank Richard Sounds Manchester for sponsoring this video. I've worked with the team there for some time now, and the staff are friendly, professional, and gives you unbiased advice about what TV to buy, even if it's not the Sony XG95 or Samsung Q90R, depending on your needs. So if you can kindly support this channel by calling them on 0333 900 0086 if you are considering buying a new TV, mention HDTV Test and they'll take care of you with great price and service. Really appreciate all your support. Thank you. So let's start with black level and contrast. Now, even though on paper the blacks are slightly shallower on the Samsung Q90R, in real life terms, the perceived blacks are actually deeper on this set compared with the Sony because of a few factors. The first is the number of local dimming zones. There is a big gap. Even though Sony has some of the best local dimming algorithm in the business, hardware limitation is hardware limitation. You just can't overcome the limited number of zones when it comes to light control and blooming suppression. And certainly what we can see is that because of the massive increase in the number of zones on the Samsung Q90R, it can actually control the light output to heighten contrast and also keep blooming to a minimum compared with the Sony XG95. So if you compare, let's say, letterbox bars in CinemaScope movies, Samsung has truly mastered the art of keeping the letterbox bars inky black, whereas on the Sony, because of the reduced number of local dimming zones and also probably because of their algorithm as well, the letterbox bars can have a grayer look in comparison with the Samsung Q90R in a pitch black room. And if you look at the scene with white letters on black background, you can see that again the Samsung Q90R does a much better job of suppressing the circumferential blooming around these bright objects against a dark background. But Samsung's local dimming algorithm is not without its downside because it is fairly aggressive. So if you actually display a low APL scene, the shadow detail may look darker than the Sony XG95, as you can see from, first of all, the scene from Gravity, and secondly, the scene from Harry Potter. Now, the local dimming setting on the Samsung Q90R, while I'm here talking about it, there are 3 levels: low, standard, and high. And for SDR content, I think the correct setting is standard. In this low APL scene, if you actually set it to low, you can see that the local dimming almost doesn't take place, as if Samsung has designed it to lift the shadow detail. But by doing this, you can see that there is a lot of clouding and graying. So I think local dimming standard for SDR, at least on the Samsung Q90R, is the optimal setting to maintain deep blacks while not crushing shadow detail excessively. The shadow detail rendition on the Samsung Q90R is better than what I saw on the Samsung Q9FN last year. The company has listened to feedback and did not present it in an aggressive manner. So the shadow detail to my eyes are still there, but it is just darker than the Sony XG95. And more shadow detail doesn't necessarily mean that it's more accurate. You know, in an ideal world, I would have liked to bring in either a Sony X300 or Sony X310 reference broadcast monitor for me to compare. Now, another side effect of the local dimming algorithm on the Samsung Q90R is that, you know, in their effort to suppress blooming, bright specular highlights, even in HDR, can actually be muted as well. For example, in this scene from The Dark Knight Rises, the lamp above Batman's head can be a bit darker than the Sony XG95, and obviously the OLEDs with their self-emissive nature will be able to generate the bright lights and the deep blacks at the same time because of their per pixel light control. But because these sets, they are full array local dimming with a limited number of zones, the companies have to decide on their algorithm, and I think what Samsung is prioritizing is keeping the blacks deep and blooming to a minimum, and they are willing to darken the highlight detail to achieve that, whereas Sony is more about accuracy, and they would like to present the highlight and shadow detail accurately, even though this means that the blacks may look shallower and blooming may be more evident. Next, we move on to colors. The Sony XG95 is definitely more color accurate than the Samsung Q90R. I can calibrate this to really a reference standard where there are no delta errors in a 140 patch color checker SG chart, whereas on the Samsung Q90R, despite my best efforts, I would still see some spikes here and there, which means that in real-life content, skin tones and general colors won't look as natural and realistic as on the Sony XG95 when you look on axis. The next thing I want to talk about is motion, and again, motion is another traditional strength of Sony televisions. Both sets have black frame insertion technology, but the one on the Sony XG95 is superior because the Japanese engineers, they have implemented an X-motion clarity black zonal insertion system that serves to increase motion resolution to 1080 lines or even higher without incurring significant drop in light output or significant increase in flicker. Now, on the Samsung, if you engage black frame insertion by activating LED clear motion, for 60 Hz content, it is not too bad. It is fairly close to the Sony XG95, except that there is a bit more visible flicker in very bright scenes. But if you engage BFI on the Samsung Q90R for 50 Hz content, you can see that judder reduction is grayed out at 10, which is the maximum value. What this means is that the Samsung Q90R, just like what happens on Samsung TVs over the past couple of years, it actually forces some frame interpolation in 50 Hz content when black frame insertion is deployed. And this is because I think the BFI technology on Samsung's televisions are 60 Hz centric, so they wouldn't want a very gross mismatch between 50 Hz content and a 60 Hz centric BFI, which will cause quite significant judder and stuttering and frame skipping. So they force the frame interpolation on 50 Hz content, but as a direct result, you will get more soap opera effect and also interpolation artifacts in 50 Hz broadcast that we get in the UK and Europe or any other PAL regions. And should you choose not to engage black frame insertion but only use motion compensated frame interpolation, again the Sony is superior because it doesn't introduce any frame skipping or significant interpolation artifacts, whereas on the Samsung Q90R in this off-air broadcast from ITV, you can see that as the camera cut from one angle to another, cut from one face to another, the Samsung Q90R with motion compensated frame interpolation engaged in terms of Auto Motion Plus, it will present some micro stutter or micro judder that is evident in terms of the hands or the head shaking slightly. So motion goes to Sony, and the next thing I want to talk about is video processing. And when it comes to video processing, again, the Sony wins out in terms of gradation. I'm showing this clip here, which is from the upcoming Spears & Mansell UHD HDR benchmark disc. On this test pattern, which is a rotating ramp posterization test pattern, you can see that the Sony is doing much better in terms of smoothing out the gradation in the rotating ramps, even without engaging smooth gradation, whereas the Samsung Q90R is definitely presenting a bit more stair-stepped posterization or quantization artifact as the colors and the grayscale rotate around on 8-bit and 10-bit patterns. Next, let's talk about upscaling. The Samsung Q90R is equipped with what the company calls AI upscaling, which is a trickle down from their 8K sets introduced last year, whereas the Sony XG95 has its top tier X1 Ultimate chipset. Now, in the past, I've always thought that Sony's upscaling is the best in the business, but the upscaling on the Q90R is truly impressive. It's no slouch as well. So if we display the standard definition content, which is in 576i, it's the SMPTE RP133 test pattern, you can see that the Samsung Q90R, just like other Samsung televisions in the past, you can't actually disable overscan, so it will be zoomed and stretched slightly. But despite that, it is actually maintaining the sharpness and detail to the same degree, perhaps even slightly better than the Sony XG95. If we display this terrestrial broadcast from ITV SD, you can see that the pattern on his sweater and the grass on the lawn and also the trees in the background just have slightly more texture and definition than the Sony XG95, which is really impressive, especially when you are considering that the Samsung has to zoom in slightly because the overscan cannot be disabled. And if I go into this next shot, which is again in 576i, the Samsung just cleans up the noise slightly better compared with the Sony XG95, which I think is a testament to the prowess of the upscaling on the Samsung set. But if we go to a 1080i HD feed, again captured off broadcast, now this is where the X1 Ultimate truly comes into its own. In this frame here, the grass and the general foliage just look a bit sharper and more defined on the Sony than the Samsung Q90R. And if we go into the next scene from Skyfall, the wrinkles and stubbles on Daniel Craig's face is just a bit sharper and clearer on the Sony XG95. So I would say that, they are about on par generally. What I want to talk about next is screen uniformity, and it is difficult for me to tell you that the screen uniformity that you see on these review samples that I have in this room here is going to be representative of what you're going to get at home because of panel lottery. But just on the basis of what I have in front of me, the Sony XG95 is just slightly cleaner, but the Samsung Q90R doesn't have as much DSE or dirty screen effect as last year's Samsung Q9FN. Again, if you are seeing lots of artifacts on camera, it is because the camera is somehow capturing different full array local dimming grids behind the screen, which is actually not present when I watch it in real life. Next, we go to HDR, and I think that the local dimming high setting on the Samsung Q90R, which by the way is necessary to hit the highest peak brightness that is demanded by high dynamic range content. And while I'm here, I might as well just tell you the peak brightness I've measured on both sets, calibrated. The Samsung Q90R is capable of around 1600 nits on a 10% window once calibrated to D65 white point, whereas the Sony XG95 is capable of 1100 nits. In this particular scene from Batman vs Superman, you can see that the Samsung Q90R is actually hyper-enhancing the film grain, making it much noisier, and also on Gal Gadot's neckline here, I just can't stop admiring it. You can see that the gradation and the tonal transition is much harsher than what you see on the Sony XG95. And again, I'm using this test pattern here from the Spears & Mansell UHD HDR benchmark disc. This is basically just grayscale windows. And if I scroll through this test pattern, you can see that the average picture level are very similar between both sets. And this is with the Samsung Q90R set to movie mode, by the way. But if I summon this information from our Oppo 203 player, you can see that the window actually brightens up before calming down again, indicating some sort of dynamic processing going on. So the next thing I want to talk about is gaming. On the Samsung Q90R, input lag measured 18 milliseconds, and on the Sony XG95 or X950G, input lag measured 21 milliseconds. It is not a massive difference. But there are other features that are in favor of either the Samsung or the Sony. On the Samsung, you get auto low latency mode or ALLM, which means that the TV can kick into game mode every time you play a game. And also it has VRR or variable refresh rate support from the Xbox One X in terms of FreeSync 2, whereas none of these two HDMI 2.1 features are present on the Sony XG95. However, when in game mode, some people out there, I'm not saying many people, I'm certainly not one of them, but some people are very sensitive to PWM image duplication. So the PWM is actually operating at 120 Hz on the Samsung Q90R, which may result in some visible image duplication when you are playing games on consoles. So some people are sensitive to this image duplication, but I'm not, so it doesn't generally bother me. Whereas the PWM on the Sony XG95 is operating at a much higher frequency. So if you are sensitive to image duplication, you may want to go for the Sony. Another advantage of the Sony in terms of the game mode and also the graphics mode, especially if you want to use it as a large monitor for gaming or other desktop work, is that you can maintain full 444 chroma in game mode and graphics mode on the Sony, whereas the Samsung is impossible to actually achieve in that regard. So that is just a brief overview of the strengths and weaknesses of both sets compared side by side. If you found this video useful, please click the like button and subscribe to the HDTV Test YouTube channel for more videos like this. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.